Hello, good morning, good afternoon from wherever you're joining us. On behalf of the Othering and Belonging Institute and Over Zero, welcome. Today we're launching a project called Engendering Authoritarianism, a 6-strategy framework examining how political and cultural leaders weaponize gender in ways that advance authoritarianism. This project explores how movements leverage and weaponize gender broadly understood to include gender identity, women's rights, LGBT rights, in order to divide society in opposition movements, launder and normalize social hierarchies, reshape cultural norms, and lay the groundwork for authoritarian power and consolidation. With me today, we have Laura Livingston, which is the Senior Director of Field Support and Strategy at Over Zero. Hi, Laura.
Hello, it's great to be here.
And Chandra, who has a PhD in political science with a designated emphasis in gender studies from UC Berkeley and has been an incredible consultant on this project.
Thanks for having me, Míriam.
We will be touching on a lot of things, so this is maybe a little bit of a warning. We know that we will be providing a lot of information, so we want to encourage that you all look at our report, but also at the microsite that we're launching today. The microsite has summaries, unpacks the strategies that we will be presenting, as well as it has snapshots as well. And we will be incorporating a repository of resources in the coming weeks, case studies, as well as in phase 2 of this project, a variety of resources, video and audio interviews with practitioners that focus on counter strategies. Before we launch into the presentation, and we will have some time for a Q&A at the end, and we also wanted to make a disclaimer, which is that both the Othering and Belonging Institute and Over Zero are 501c3 organizations, so we do not lobby for or against specific legislation or policies, and this project is not intended to support or oppose candidates for political office or any electoral outcomes. And with that being said, there's a lot to unpack. So we will start first by focusing on what is happening and really establishing the nexus between leveraging, weaponizing narratives and policies to do with a variety of dimensions related to gender and sexuality, and the advancement of authoritarian practices, anti-democratic practices, and political violence. And I think something noteworthy as well is that both Over Zero and OBI are not organizations that work in the gender justice space. We come from a different place. So Laura, if you could tell us why gender, why this project, why gender and authoritarianism?
Yeah, thank you so much, Míriam. I just also want to say it's really such an honor to be here and to have worked on this project alongside you and OBI and Chandra. So Over Zero really came to this topic from an observation, from recognizing that there was this global trend of narratives that were manipulating concerns about traditional and family values, about demographic change, that were leveraging gender-related anxieties to target and scapegoat women's rights, feminism, the LGBTQ community, and that these narratives were having the impact of dividing societies. They were being used as a major electoral strategy. And ultimately, they were normalizing social hierarchies and facilitating power consolidation and authoritarianism, and even violence in the name of protecting against this engineered enemy, whether that was feminists, the LGBTQ community, or so-called gender ideology. But that none of this was really being considered a democracy issue. Instead, it was being written off as another round in the culture wars, or as partisan politics as usual, or as a critical human rights issue, which it is, but not something that was impacting the health of our democracy. And this felt like a really dangerous blind spot or vulnerability for pro-democracy work at this time of global democratic recession. And so with this project and building on an earlier report on queer scapegoating that we developed in partnership with Seth Flaxman, we really wanted to make the case that efforts to weaponize gender are a democracy issue. They are a key tactic in the authoritarian playbook that is used to facilitate power consolidation and even to provide a permission structure for violence. So if you care about democracy, if you care about authoritarianism, you need to be considering gender and sexuality. And there are a few additional points that I just want to make at the top. I know we're going to go through how all of this is happening throughout the remainder of the discussion, but just a few things that I want to say now. First, attacks on gender and sexuality are intertwined, and they need to be considered together. So in some instances, authoritarians may leverage pre-existing homophobia to ultimately go after women and women's rights. And we saw this with arguments against ratifying the Istanbul Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women because it purportedly promoted homosexuality. In other instances, authoritarians may pit women's and LGBTQ rights against one another, framing LGBTQ people and particularly trans people as a threat to women's advancement. This is not an accidental strategy or tactic. It is deliberate. Authoritarians know that a united coalition threatens their power. And in other instances, anti-LGBTQ legislation provides a legal template or a blueprint for ultimately restricting women's rights. And we saw this in Russia as one example, where laws banning so-called homosexual propaganda provided a blueprint for a later law that banned so-called child-free propaganda, or any information or groups that promoted the virtues of women choosing not to have children. And there are many other examples, but I really want to emphasize how important it is to be viewing these attacks together. I also want to note that gender and sexuality are particularly potent issues for authoritarians to weaponize. These are deeply rooted and intimate aspects of our identity that shape how we understand ourselves and how we relate to the world and to one another. So if political leaders are able to regulate these most personal and intimate aspects of ourselves, they have a starting point for control at this deeply personal level that extends into the most intimate aspects of our private lives. They also touch on other identity characteristics that are often weaponized, such as race, migration, religion, which I know we'll talk about more throughout today. And then I want to note that there is this important role of nostalgia in all of this. Authoritarians are able to leverage this discomfort and discontent with modern society and say that we as a country or you as an individual are no longer great because that group over there has sapped us of our strength. And once we address that group or this threat, we can return to our former glory, to this mythologized past, and often the social hierarchies and the traditional gender roles that entailed. This is something that Anne Applebaum calls restorative nostalgia. So we need to be considering the role of memory and nostalgia in all of this. And finally, I will just say that this has never been more relevant or urgent. So we are releasing this report, we are launching this microsite amid a deluge of rhetoric, of policies, of actions that are rolling back foundational gains for women's rights, feminism, the LGBTQ community, and even seeking to delegitimize the trans identity. And we have seen popularized chants of your body, my choice following the 2024 election, religious groups with close ties to the administration that are claiming that women should not have the right to vote, and an increasingly implemented Project 2025 that reviews restoring family values as actualized in part through deleting the terms gender, gender equality, gender equity, reproductive health, and reproductive rights from every federal rule. And this is just in the US. We know the US is not alone in facing these threats and in navigating these dynamics. So I feel really glad to be together with both of you and this larger group in thinking about this issue.
Thank you, Laura. And obviously from an OBI and Democracy and Belonging Forum standpoint, there's myriad of reasons as well to explore this intersection between leveraging a variety of narratives and policies to do with gender to advance authoritarianism. Obviously of concern is the targeting of feminists, women's rights, the LGBT community, and in particular trans people, which is of concern. But also as well, we as an organization that's concerned with how can we build and create democracies rooted in belonging that don't continue to perpetuate structural othering and violence. This is a thread that we saw across the board. When doing research on the rise of authoritarian populist movements across Europe and North America and other parts of the world as well, the issue of gender, the weaponization of rhetoric on things to do with gender identity and sexuality was common across the board. But it's also noteworthy as well that unlike maybe some other social categories, gender is also used flexibly and quite inconsistently as well. So while oftentimes the LGBT community, for example, is targeted, in other circumstances, far-right authoritarian populist movements will co-opt women's rights or LGBT rights in order to build anti-migrant or anti-Islam discourses. So this is something that we wanted to unpack. Also recognizing, as Laura mentioned, that there were many gaps that we were seeing in the democracy space, depolarization space, and also like the whole ecosystem as a whole. Sometimes considering that gender was not a central component, and we don't claim that it is the only one. It's just that it is a very important one that's often misunderstood or dismissed as another iteration in the culture wars. And of course, as Laura mentioned as well, gender identity, women's rights, and sexuality are social categories that interact with other categories that are also being weaponized to advance authoritarianism, in particular, race, migration, and religion. I'm sure that a lot of the people that are joining this event today are familiar with the Great Replacement theory, but this is a theory that really brings together or fuses racial and gender anxieties all at once, positing in its origins as a French strategy, as a theory or conspiracy that was popularized in France, that white people were being replaced by people of color and by the elites, and perpetuating a variety of racialized tropes, but always building on demographic and gender-based anxieties. But as I mentioned, this happens flexibly as well. Sometimes we also see what is often referred as feminationalism or homonationalism, which is the co-optation of women's and LGBT rights. And this happens in particular across Western Europe. An example is the Party for Freedom in the Netherlands, which is an extremist party that, for example, included in its latest manifesto in the last general elections that LGBT rights are a pillar of Dutch society, because they were using LGBT rights as a way of building narratives against Muslims and migrants, which they said endanger women's rights, LGBT rights, and so on. So gender really is used inconsistently and flexibly across some of these movements as well. And that's something that we also wanted to unpack through this project. Also, we saw how there's a lot of transnational cooperation, shared strategies, and shared rhetoric. And a lot of it coalesced around the idea of fighting gender ideology, which I'm sure like a lot of us have become familiarized over the past couple of years, but that we also know that has roots in decades ago. So Tara, if you want to share a little bit on that, please.
Sure. So I think Laura and Míriam gave us such a great foundation for explaining how gender and authoritarianism are related and where this project came from. I'm going to talk a little bit more about something specific that is integral to the weaponization of gender by authoritarian populists, and it's something we've been hearing a lot about lately, and we refer to it as so-called gender ideology. If you sort of live in the zeitgeist, this is not a new term to you. And so I'm going to talk about three things. First, how did gender ideology, the idea of this gender ideology, come about? What is it? And how did it become the boogeyman that it is today? So first, although it seems like you really can't stop hearing the term gender ideology these days, the term has been around since actually the mid-1990s. And it was coined by the Catholic Church in the mid-1990s, around the same time that Hillary Clinton was declaring women's rights are human rights. So it's just a lot of social change happening around that time. The recognition, kind of increasing recognition within society that women, women don't just have to be moms and wives, but they can also be present in the workplace. This idea of sort of having it all was becoming more popularized. And at the same time, the movement to recognize LGBTQ rights and LGBTQ families was starting to build some traction as well. So this phrase, so-called gender ideology, was coined by the Catholic Church in response to a lot of these sort of very new social dynamics, and has sort of taken root since that time. So what is this phrase? We refer to it as a rhetorical device, and we argue that it should be understood as the symbolic glue that connects many loose, abstract ideas, that there's not one really clear, specific meaning, and nor is it something that's very tangible, that it's actually a phrase that has become kind of a catch-all for everything ranging from complaints about LGBTQ rights and progress on LGBTQ rights to feminism, to reproductive technologies. in some cases, it's even used as a way to like capture a critique against capitalism. So it's a very broad, wide-ranging term, and that's kind of part of the point, is that it's purposely abstract. And anti-gender actors use this phrase on purpose to push the narrative that it operates, that there's this sort of conspiracy by the minority to impose wokeness or to impose some sort of progressive view that lacks common sense, but that, you know, there's this sort of elite class of conspiracy theorists who are trying to impose this on the majority. And so that's kind of what we explain as what is gender ideology. And I want to talk briefly about how it's being used. So the varied and indistinct meaning that it has gives authoritarian populists a lot of, as Míriam said, flexibility in how they can apply the usage of this term. And it's been, as you can see, capitalized on by authoritarian populists over the past several decades, but especially we've seen that the usage of this phrase grow immensely over the past 10 years or so. And we are going to talk about in a few minutes the strategies that we identify. But what's really important is to understand that gender ideology, this idea of so-called gender ideology, is used to lay the groundwork to construct an enemy that threatens the heart of the nation. And then this threat of so-called gender ideology is framed as so immense that extraordinary measures are necessary to prevent it from spreading. And we're going to talk about how that actually happens in a few minutes. It's also important to understand that so-called gender ideology is purposely framed as an ideology because, first, it's very abstract. And as I mentioned, you can basically dump anything into this bucket that is too progressive or too woke and call it so-called gender ideology. But also this abstraction allows anti-gender actors to brush away the reality that gender is a deeply personal part of one's identity and one's self-conception, and that gender identity has historically been the basis for discrimination. So Laura mentioned, the intentionality of this and how deeply personal gender is and how it's very critical to the weaponization of gender is very critical to the implementation of the anti-democratic practices that we're going to talk about. But it's also important to know that the abstraction really helps to prevent the understanding of gender as this deeply personal thing. And so attacking so-called gender ideology allows anti-gender actors to be seen as attacking a set of ideas or beliefs as opposed to an actual category of people who are already tend to be targeted in society. And we're going to talk about some of those groups. And second, using the phrase gender ideology provides cover for those people who have this political project against claims of bigotry or discrimination because it's framed as a battle against a set of ideas or beliefs rather than a project to remove rights and protections from minority groups. And at the same time, that these anti-gender actors are pushing policies that actually strip gender and sexual minorities and women of their rights, they're phrasing it as attacking a set of beliefs which protects them from claims of discrimination. And so it's a very important phrase. We use it, we explain it in the report, and I encourage you to actually check out the section where we discuss the use of language. And Míriam, I'll hand it back to you to talk about the strategies.
Thank you, Tara. And I think understanding this rhetorical device and this separating people from ideas or ideologies, a key strategy in order to build support for that attack is a key feature of authoritarian populism, which needs to rely on popular support in order to at least attain power. And so it is, in a way, a key mechanism in order to also legitimize political violence, which, Laura, I think you can tell us more about.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, all of this is closely tied to political and identity-based violence. So, Míriam, as you were just saying, Tara, as you were explaining, authoritarian populists often cast feminists, those pushing for women's rights, LGBTQ people, and anyone associated with so-called gender ideology as enemies and as threats to our traditional values, to our way of life, to our women and children. And fighting these enemies justifies expanding state power, dismantling any checks on that power, and then targeting these groups with violence. It also normalizes targeting any group that's deemed a threat with violence. It sets a precedent for that. And I want to note that by design, threats and physical violence push targeted groups from participating in public life, from showing up to vote, from running for elected office, from participating in various community events. And this is true for those who are immediately targeted, but it is also true for their broader communities who may fear that they will face the same, or for those who might speak up in defense of those who are being targeted because they worry that they are next. And so in this way, political violence serves as an enforcement mechanism for social hierarchies and intergroup divisions that authoritarians often seek to construct. And they are a tool that authoritarians can use to say who can participate in public life, who can hold power, and who needs to stay home. And this is what we are seeing play out with the weaponization of gender. So gender narratives that hold that women are too emotional, they're too incompetent, they're too untrustworthy to hold positions of power, or that doing so would violate their patriotic duty to procreate. We're seeing how these narratives are underpinning violent and sexualized threats and harassment that are targeting women in power, and then how these narratives are also being used as an electoral strategy. So the Brennan Center found that women holding state and local office were 3 to 4 times more likely than men to experience abuse targeting their gender. Women of color face even higher levels of abuse. And this has spilled over into actual violent plots, as we saw perhaps most notably with the case to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer amid a deluge of violent, sexualized, and gendered threats that targeted her over her COVID policies. And the impact of this is exactly as designed and as exactly what we would expect. So in the US, for instance, the Brennan Center found that half of the women office holders that they surveyed said that they were less willing to run for re-election because of the types of gendered threats and harassment that they faced. And the US is not alone. According to the International Parliamentary Union, almost half of women legislators in Europe have also received death threats or threats of rape or beating, and the impact of this is the same as we are seeing in the US. We've also seen how narratives about purportedly protecting women and children have underpinned policies that ultimately target them with violence, and these protection narratives are a key component of efforts to weaponize gender. And one recent and particularly horrifying example of this has been ICE's recent detainments and deportations, often without due process, which have been justified in part by the longstanding and baseless narrative that immigrants pose a particular threat to women and children. But while ICE's actions have been justified in part under the false pretext of protecting women, they've actually endangered women. Many of the people who have been deported are women, are mothers, are women who are pregnant or still breastfeeding. In one case, it resulted in a stillbirth. We can imagine that there are others. But this has also created an opportunity for more violence in society. So the way that these detainments are being conducted with ICE officials wearing plain clothes, concealing their faces, refusing to show identification for fear purportedly of being doxxed, it's created an opening for impersonations of them with men who are pretending to be ICE and kidnapping, robbing, and even raping women. And so we see overall how these narratives that are purportedly seeking to protect women are justifying state violence and are creating a permission structure and an opening for further violence in society that also endangers women.
Thanks, Laura. And maybe we'll take a moment. We recognize that was a lot already, but what we tried to do in this first section was to unpack what's happening and establish that very clear link between leveraging narratives, policies around gender, and building permission structures for authoritarian practices and political violence. What we want to do now actually is share how this is happening. And so throughout our review of the literature and also empirical analysis, we've identified that gender is leveled primarily through 6 strategies: interlocking, interrelated strategies. Obviously, these are not exhaustive, but we do believe that these are key aspects, key strategies within the authoritarian playbook for which gender is used. On the one hand, to construct a threat, to normalize authoritarian ideas, to change culture, to build a big tent movement, to divide and polarize, and to distract. So over the next 15 minutes or so, we will try to share a little bit, a brief introduction to how gender feels or is used to advance each of these strategies, with some examples. And again, we recommend that you look at the report on the microsite because there's much more there. So what role does it play constructing a threat, Laura?
Sure. So the first strategy, constructing a threat, touches on a lot of what I was just saying, and is also perhaps the most intuitive. Authoritarian populists frame feminists, LGBTQ people, anyone associated with so-called gender ideology as the shared enemy that represents a threat to our way of life, to our cultural and physical security, to our women and children. And eradicating this threat provides a pretext for expanding state power, for dismantling checks on that power, and even for violence targeting these groups. We saw this in the example that I was just talking about with ICE, but another well-known example of this is how Russia justified its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 as protecting traditional Russian values against this morally degenerate West and against gender and sexual equalities. Another example of this that we have seen in the US, though there are unfortunately many, many more of them, is how the threat of so-called gender ideology and LGBTQ people has in Texas and in other states laid the groundwork for a web of past and proposed legislation that has extended the arm of the state into private homes, into classrooms, into doctors' offices, and even into other states, with Texas attempting to sue other states who have administered abortions to Texas residents. So there are abortion bounty laws that encourage citizens to report on their neighbors for getting abortions. There's also a series of book bans that encourage students and parents to report on those who teach books that in any way deal with gender or sexuality, including books that touch on sexual violence and what to do about it. So in addition to extending the state's reach and extending state power, again, purportedly in the name of protecting against gender ideology, this has fostered a culture of surveillance. It has encouraged and even incentivized citizens to police one another's behavior, and has created what Adam Serwer in The Atlantic described as the snitch state that we typically don't think of in American society, but gender is providing this pretext for creating.
Thanks so much, Laura. I'm going to talk about the second strategy. You'll find these in order in the report as well, which we call normalize authoritarianism. And this strategy explains how gender is a medium through which anti-democratic practices are normalized, and how citizens are socialized into passivity around the erosion of ideas of equal rights and protections for all, and how gender is key in this democratic erosion. And what makes this strategy particularly complex is that authoritarian populists rarely reject democracy outright. You rarely see a person who, we would call an authoritarian populist stand up and say, I am an authoritarian populist. Instead, what makes this so tricky is that they co-opt the language of democracy and frame themselves as the actual defenders of democracy, and the majority population as being oppressed by so-called gender ideology and all the things that we just discussed that get lumped into that. So in this strategy, you actually often see language that suggests that the authoritarian populist is the real defender of democracy and the defender of the true heart and soul of the nation, and is the safeguarder of the traditional nation against the threatening forces of feminism and gender equality and so-called gender ideology. And so gender is integral to this strategy because it provides a strategic entry point for these ideas. This is especially true in debates about women's roles in society. And in this narrative that's pushed, women have a very specific place in the natural order. I'm going to use natural order a lot, and you will see that the obsession with what is natural is pretty intense with these anti-gender actors. And especially in their view, women have is a particular role that they must fulfill. And simultaneously, LGBTQ individuals have a much more limited role. And trans people in particular should, in their view, have none. And this idea of gender and sexual hierarchy is then used to normalize the idea that in society, some people, some groups of people should have more political rights and freedoms than others. And this is something you see in the US and in other countries as well, the idea that this family order should map onto the social order. So I'm going to explain a little bit about how that happens. Anti-gender actors believe their sort of narrative structure has three central tenets. The first is complementarity, which is the idea that men and women should have complementary but not equal roles, which is obviously antithetical to the idea of feminism and gender equality. And this carries the implication that women should be subservient to men who should serve in their natural roles as the head of the family. The second tenet is familialism, which is a form of politics that suggests that the traditional natural family, which in their view consists of a married man and his wife and their biological children, and as Míriam stated, this often also overlaps with race, so the ideal sort of family is also a white family, should be the policy priority of all sort of political processes. And the third is sexual and social hierarchy, which is the idea that, again, this white, traditional, heterosexual nuclear family is the foundation of any stable and healthy society, and that men have a natural place at the top of that hierarchy. And that this is, again, then extrapolated to suggest that men, especially white men, should have a natural place at the top of the social and political hierarchy as well. So when you hear a lot of this language about how families should be and the importance of family, it's not just an idea about how families should be. This is an idea of actually how society should be that begins with this idea of the nuclear family and then is extrapolated and mapped onto society at large to suggest that the erosion of rights for some particular groups of people is justified. And what's really interesting about this strategy is that these ideas are often delivered by cultural actors rather than political actors. And there's a good example in the report, which I encourage you to read, which I'll just mention briefly here, where we talk about trad wives, which are their tradition. Trad wife is short for traditional wife. And these are women who embrace the return to a more traditional time. And I want to note that these women are not to be confused with stay-at-home mothers. These are women who present feminism as dangerous for women and for the family. They encourage women to embrace their natural roles as mothers and homemakers. A lot of them encourage women to serve in their more subservient role and allow their husbands to be in their natural roles as the head of the household. So this is a very different particular cultural phenomenon that we've been seeing. And although, there are a lot of them, so I'm generalizing broadly, although they're generally not overtly political actors, although some of them are, and you can read about that in the report, the family and social model that they advocate for is strongly supported by political actors, especially in Project 2025. And we note this because it's important. It shows how these ideas about family and, society are actually not limited just to that, but it actually becomes part of a broader political project. Project 2025, for example, explicitly calls for policies to increase the birth rate, to encourage married couples to have children, and to allow children to be raised by the parents who conceive them, which obviously carries a lot of implications for reproductive technologies and for LGBTQ families. And so you can see the sort of normalization of the idea that particular types of families don't fit the mold of what a normal natural family should be. And this is used to implement anti-democratic practices later on.
Thank you, Tara. And I think the normalized authoritarian ideas, when we were working on this project, is one of the strategies that we struggled with the most. I think it's also because it touches on the reality that there's a lot of a confluence of a variety of actors, and we'll speak about big tent movements later on. But I also wanted to underscore or recognize that different actors that are part of these have sometimes overlapping, but also sometimes different motives. And I think that that's something that I wanted to mention as well, because we particularly see that in its transnational dimension as well, that we will touch on later on. Some are very committed to the tenets that Tara was speaking about in the anti-gender movement, but others see it more as transactional in terms of, jumping on the anti-gender bandwagon or using homonationalism and feminationalism is the best conduit in order to attain power and normalize authoritarianism. And as Tara was mentioning, oftentimes this doesn't happen in what we would consider, in a strict sense, the political realm. A strategy that's a key part of this as well is to change culture. And this is something that traces back to the 1960s. A group of French far-right thinkers started interpreting Marxist theory on Antonio Gramsci, arguing that cultural change must come before political power. So rather than trying to seize power outright, the idea was to reshape public attitudes, reshape what people see as normal, acceptable, or as common sense. And I think that in particular right now, if we pay attention, we see how authoritarian populists often try to appropriate the common sense position. And oftentimes they do that through gender, because a lot of the debates, a lot of the conversations we're having on gender are incredibly complex. Sometimes they touch on issues that only affect a small percentage of the population. And so it's easier to do that rhetorical jump of claiming the common sense position. For the nerds in the room, that this is generally called metapolitics in academia, but it's this idea of influencing how people understand politics, identity, values, and society through making certain ideas appear reasonable or inevitable over time. And this happens particularly through two main conduits. On the one hand, by building and establishing intellectual and education institutions that can help normalize these ideas, produce literature, provide arguments to political leaders. And I think I just want to emphasize this as well, like the world of ideas, the intellectual infrastructure is incredibly important. And Project 2025 has been mentioned a lot here. And of course, the Heritage Foundation would be an example, but there's also the Matthias Corvinus School, I believe it's called, in Hungary. One of the leaders of the French far right, Míriam Maréchal, was also promoting an institute for the social sciences, I believe it was called. So there's a variety of spaces that are being created to provide that intellectual architecture. The other one, which I think is a little bit more insidious, is through introducing these ideas in environments that are not primarily political or primarily partisan, or at least don't self-present as such. They are channels that generally pretend to be just about lifestyle content or fitness subcultures. Tara was mentioning the Tradwives, and that's an example, but we can also see it in like gaming communities online. I think there's been a lot of conversation over the past few months around podcasters as well. And I think it's interesting as well because they generally present as transcending left-right dynamics, or they will promote certain ideas through posing questions and saying that we just want to seek the truth, or I'm just a truth teller. But in reality, these ideas that Tara was mentioning are actually permeating these communities. They are oftentimes also gateway communities that are located in physical spaces as well. So there's a lot of research that has been done about the mixed martial arts communities, for example, where particularly men can go and train, but then it's spaces that are being targeted by extremists in order to recruit people into the far right as well. And I think that's something noteworthy to mention as well, is that oftentimes these spaces, or these are communities that are quite effective in terms of recruitment because they respond to real anxieties that oftentimes are gendered, and that as such we have a responsibility to also be interrogating and responding to. And they are communities that are also oftentimes segregated and gendered, and then oftentimes also provide a sense of agency. And we can touch on that later on in the Q&A, unpacking a little bit like the cultural aspect and the role of fitness spaces, empowerment, and agency as well. The last thing in terms of this is that obviously why this is a pre-political strategy as we presented it, it's not something that ends once power is achieved. So in the United States, we saw how the new administration took over the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, which was partially federally funded arts institution, which historically has had bipartisan support. But when President Trump came into power, he purged the board, named himself chair, and replaced its longtime president with an ally, justifying the takeover on Truth Social by noting, and I quote, that just last year, the Kennedy Center featured drag shows specifically targeting our youth. This will stop. And this also happens across Europe as well. As an example, the far-right party Vox in Spain, it's a party that has never had power at the national level. However, it's managed to enter some local or regional governments. And through that, they have taken positions as the heads of the cultural department and tried to influence the kind of like arts and cultural policy that it's being advanced, going so far as censoring the movie Lightyear or work by Virginia Woolf. So a lot to unpack there as well in terms of the cultural strategies.
Thanks so much, Míriam. I'm going to talk a little bit about strategy number 4 now, which is build a big tent. And you can see Míriam already sort of like laid the groundwork for this, thinking about all the different, the big ecosystem of actors that exist and come together to implement these strategies. So this strategy, build a big tent, recognizes that in order to attain power, political leaders must construct a strong base and mobilize large swaths of people. And authoritarian populists in particular do this by weaponizing misogyny, pronatalism, and opposition to so-called gender ideology in order to unite an unlikely band of actors and broaden their access to a wider coalition of financial and political support. In the report, we call this like the motley crew of actors. So I'm just thinking about that as I like have a visualization in my head of a motley crew of people who come together to, in sometimes transactional ways, but sometimes not, to provide financial and political support to authoritarian leaders. So in this strategy, so-called gender ideology in particular is often used as a unifying force, again, because it's so abstract, basically anything can be dumped into that bucket. And we in the academic literature kind of refer to this as the symbolic glue that brings together actors to advance a particular political project. But what's really interesting is that these actors often have contradictory beliefs, and they're not all on the same page in terms of sharing a wide variety of policy preferences. So this big tent includes far-right parties, nativists, pronatalists who just want to increase the birth rate, and also includes trans-exclusionary radical feminists who obviously are not anti-feminism, but are united into this bucket by virtue of their opposition to so-called gender ideology and inclusion of trans rights. So this motley crew often also empowers and provides legitimacy to fringe groups that would not otherwise be taken seriously. And I think that's really important because this big tent then starts to include groups that have quite radical ideas, and it's part of sort of overlaps with what we were talking about before, which is the idea of normalizing these ideas and the policies that they would ideally implement. And as I mentioned, the relationship between these cultural leaders and political leaders can often be transactional. I think Míriam mentioned earlier, the idea that you just jump into the anti-gender train because it's leading you where you want to go. Others actually really deeply believe the tenets that are associated with anti-gender policy preferences. So sometimes they are transactional, sometimes they're not. But overall, they are mutually reinforcing and mutually beneficial for both the political leaders and the cultural leaders. For example, and again, you can read the examples in the report, but I'll just briefly touch on one here. The World Congress of Families is an international group whose mission is to unite those around the world who want to prioritize the natural family. And the Southern Poverty Law Center calls the World Congress of Families an umbrella for a massive network pushing for restrictions to LGBT rights under the guise of the defense of the natural family, which they define as the World Congress of Families define as a heterosexual married couple with their biological children. And not annually, but every year, a few years, the World Congress of Families holds conferences that provide platforms then to authoritarian populists. These political leaders then use this global platform to access new supporters, new constituencies, importantly, new funding sources, while the World Congress of Families benefits from the legitimacy of having global leaders speak at its conferences. And we'll just look at a couple of examples here. So both Viktor Orban of Hungary and Giorgia Meloni of Italy have spoken at the World Congress of Families conferences in the past, and both have become internationally recognizable, in part because of their participation in events like these. There are lots of tweetable viral moments that are, created for these conferences, and they've both gained opportunities to speak around the world and raise their international profile by virtue of this these types of conferences. And in fact, Georgia Maloney was invited to speak at CPAC earlier this year, and so there's also this this big tent also moves around with actors supporting each other in different causes along the way.
Yeah. Thank you, Tara. And what's fascinating as well is that they're also harnessing the power of influencers and socialites. In one of the World Congresses of Families, they brought, for example, a big Spanish aristocrat that was also sharing about the World Congress and Families in her Instagram and so on. So it's the idea of the big tent also, as we unpacked or try to understand how to resist the rise of authoritarian populism, is something that we really need to be exploring. The next strategy is divide and polarize, and I think that much like construct a threat is one that we probably can intuitively understand and relate to. This happens at two levels. On the one hand, to polarize society, framing gender issues as inherently divisive, but also in order to fracture and exploit division amongst pro-democracy coalitions and opposition to authoritarian power. I think it's important for us as OBI and Over Zero, I think I can speak on Over Zero, so we have here as well, to recognize that we stand for pluralism, and we recognize that there's religious, spiritual, political reasons for which people will hold a variety of views on a lot of the issues related to gender, sexuality, women's rights, and so on. But that's not what we're talking about here. Is not about like having a uniform view or position on every single topic. It's about the fact that those divides existing are exploited in order to advance authoritarianism, and gender has provided particularly fertile ground in this respect. We unpack the way in which, or the mechanics of this strategy as well, but it's oftentimes picking like very particular topics, and there's many examples of how this happens around trans rights, in order to bring those that are more complex into the public conversation, make them very salient, and define the terms of the debate in order that it's very much around us versus them and black and white terms. So this is something to be aware of as well, so that like we are not also inadvertently contributing to this division and polarization. Because we also know from the democracy and authoritarianism literature that polarized voters generally are more open to accepting anti-democratic transgressions from those that they view as their in-group. So dividing and polarization really is a key strategy, and gender has served as a very potent tool in order to proceed with that strategy. And Laura, you'll walk us through Distract.
Yes, I will take us home. So our sixth strategy is distract. And we know that authoritarian populist leaders leverage gender and gender-related controversies to stir outrage and to divert public attention from corruption, from ineffective or unpopular policies, and also from power grabs. And this is both a political strategy, but also a cultural one. So politically, it allows authoritarians to consolidate power while the public is consumed with a perceived threat or is too distracted to notice or too polarized to care what they are doing. Culturally, it also keeps gender, this lightning rod issue, it keeps it as salient as possible. So authoritarians can use this to their advantage. They can focus the public debate on a scapegoated group or on a deliberately divisive issue and use this to dominate the conversation. There are many examples of this happening around the world. And so we've seen, for instance, in Turkey, President Erdogan declared 2025 the year of the family. He claimed he wanted to combat this policy of genderlessness that was purportedly attacking the family as the central structure of Turkish society. Commentators noted that this actually was an attempt to distract both from the unprecedented poverty and inflation and the rising cost of living in Turkey, but also the growing rate of femicides in Turkey that was happening following Turkey's withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention that protected women from domestic violence and violence against women. I will note, I mentioned this earlier, that Turkey withdrew from the Istanbul Convention because it purportedly advanced homosexuality. So another example of leveraging homophobia to ultimately endanger women. In Hungary recently, we have seen Orbán ratchet up attacks on so-called gender ideology and on LGBTQ people as he is facing the most potent political opposition in his 14-year tenure in power. And he's doing this to drum all of this up and to mobilize his base, but also to distract from measures that are making it even harder for opposition parties to run in elections. In the US, we have also seen how the intense scapegoating of the trans community has been used to distract from unpopular or inconsistent stances on abortion, but also from ineffective and unpopular policies. So there are many examples of authoritarian populist leaders using this to distract the public from things that they don't want them to be concerned with or focusing on. That is our 6-strategy framework for how authoritarian populists leverage gender in service of power consolidation. I know that we just threw a lot at you, but what we really want to drive home throughout all of this is that efforts to weaponize gender are not random or accidental. They are not just partisan politics as usual, but they are a strategy that is being used to facilitate power consolidation and even violence. And so we really encourage you to read the full report where we go into these strategies in more depth, and also the microsite, which includes the list of all of the snapshots and examples that we go into in the report that explains how this is really operating. I also really want to emphasize that we all have a role to play in pushing back on this. Just as these strategies can help us in organizing how this is happening, they can also serve as an organizing framework for pushing back and for responding to these strategies. And what we just presented is the first part of a multi-part project that will be examining how this is weaponized, but also what we can do about it, and be platforming and amplifying incredible work from activists around the world who are doing just that. And so we encourage you to join us on this journey for the next phase, where we will be looking at counter strategies. And again, we really all have a role to play in pushing back on this, and together we can turn the tide. So with that, I will hand it back to Míriam.
Thank you. So we're gonna address some of the questions that were posted in the chat. So I'll briefly address 2 of the questions and then pass the baton to Laura and Tara, if that seems right. And there's a lot coming on, as I mentioned, and we know that we've downloaded a ton of content, but we're here at your disposal if you have any questions or want to reach out. One of the questions that came up was about the role of the rise of fitness and wellness trends and how they relate to authoritarianism. And I think that we've already touched a little bit on that in terms of like the gateway communities. But I think that's essential to consider in a variety of respects and how it intersects with a few of the strategies. On the one hand, it is true that some of the fitness and wellness spaces are gateway communities into some of the ideas that Tara was mentioning in normalizing ideas. It is also true that like some of the rhetoric and discourse that's developing in maybe some more progressive spaces around these wellness trends is also something that can backfire, can serve to polarize as well. So rather than necessarily labeling certain communities as such as like problematic, like whether it's mixed martial art or Pilates, it is necessarily to be engaging in these communities and also understanding what it is responding to. A lot of it from the research that I've done as well, and particularly, for example, also like wellness podcasters, a lot of the social media content does respond to whether it's a masculinity crisis or other aspects of like people who may feel alienated. And the reality is that if you're listening to a podcaster that tells you stop drinking alcohol, start exercising and going to bed early, you will and you do that, you will likely see changes. And that gives you a sense of agency and opens you up to actually being more willing to believe what other unrelated things people are saying in these spaces. While the exercising, quitting alcohol, and doing Pilates or sleeping are actually like probably good things to be doing. It's what's tied to it that may not. But there's a lot to unpack here. I'd love to do an event focused on this. So if there's more people interested, please do let us know. And I also wanted to quickly touch base on the question around how homonationalism relates to authoritarianism. And I think that in this respect, we need to think about like the ulterior motive and the goal of achieving and attaining power in order to implement anti-democratic practices and a particular worldview. This is complex because on the one hand, there's a big role for nostalgia, as Laura has mentioned, but it's also a very future-oriented political project. And if so, if there's a public that supports LGBT rights, as it happens in the Netherlands or in France, using the mantle of defending LGBT rights may be actually convenient in order to muster public support. So LGBT rights can be used flexibly. Tara, do you want to take any of the questions?
Sure. I'll take the question about, there was a question about the general trend. Is gendered violence increasing or decreasing? And I will say in my defense that I think I've done a very good job of not being the academic in the group, but I will just use a little bit of academia here to say that you're asking an empirical question. And I will point you to a number of data sets that actually measure violence against women and LGBTQ individuals. But I think there's something deeper underneath what you're asking, which is that, how do we observe these trends? And one of the reasons that we're really excited about sharing this framework is because violence is one of the very visible results of the many dynamics that we're talking about here. And in some ways, you can think of it as like the culmination or end point of a lot of the dynamics that we're talking about. And so we don't actually think that violence should be the only measurable thing that we're focusing on, although of course we are very concerned when we see violence against LGBTQ individuals and women. But we don't want to over-index on it. And what we're talking about is the sort of cultural and political normalization of stripping women of their rights, of normalizing violence against women in ways that are less visible. Laura, for example, mentioned the Istanbul Convention, which was a convention to an agreement to advocate for the protection of women against domestic violence and other forms of violence. And a number of states have, as we've discussed, used various cover stories, for lack of a better word, to basically withdraw from the Istanbul Convention. And so these are sort of worrying trends that we can see that predate what you will eventually end up in a data set that measures violence. But I would also, as an academic, say that there are a number of fantastic academics who are doing work to collect data on this that you should definitely check out.
And I will just jump in as well and say how some of these measures in the rhetoric creates a permission structure for targeting these groups with violence. And one, I think, particularly illuminating example of this is in 2013 in Russia, after the country passed the anti-homosexual propaganda bill, there was a threefold increase in violence targeting the LGBTQ community in Russia. And qualitative researchers who were combing through the hate crime data, we could also probably assume that it was a higher increase as well, because we know that these things are underreported, especially in countries where the LGBTQ community is as stigmatized as in Russia. But qualitative researchers who are going through the data noticed that the violence was different. It was more intense, it was more visceral, and it was more premeditated than prior to this law going into effect. And so what is the signal to the country and to the community about who can be targeted with violence and who is worthy of protection? Another question from the chat that I just wanted to address is how we should be thinking about current socioeconomic trends alongside the weaponization of gender. And I think that's such an important question, because we really need to be considering is why are these narratives, why are these gender narratives and the efforts to leverage gendered anxieties resonating in the way that they are today. And they are doing so amidst shifting gender roles at a time when the model of males as the breadwinner in society or as the breadwinner in families is really being questioned, and there are conflicting interpretations of that. And it's at a time when working class men in particular are facing economic vulnerability. We also need to note that all of this is coexisting with a belonging and loneliness crisis that is affecting men and boys as well. I saw someone put Richard Reeves' book in this chat. I think that's an excellent resource for all of this. And so we need to understand why these narratives are resonating so much and be able to speak to it. And absent this, it creates a vacuum that authoritarian populists and those with nefarious purposes are filling, and they're leveraging it in order to bring men and boys along in support of these harmful policies. And so there's a lot more that I would like to say on it, but I'm cognizant of time, and I see Míriam going off mute, so I will stop.
Thank you, Laura. Just wanted to wrap up because we are at time. There's so much more that we could be discussing. There's a question from Sarah about like how would we see the future of this project. So just as a reminder, there will be much more coming, a repository of resources, and then a second phase where we focus on counter strategies. We do hope to share these particularly across the democracy space, the depolarization space, journalists, and society more broadly, because we do believe that there's a gap in understanding of how issues to do with gender are weaponized. They're not just part of another iteration of the culture wars or about politics as usual. It's something else. So we do hope that we can get that understanding out, but also that the strategies help us understand how to counter them, how to build democracies rooted in belonging, how to prevent political violence, how to create something else. And with that, again, on behalf of the Othering and Belonging Institute and Over Zero, thank you very much for joining us today. We hope it was interesting. We know it was a lot, but we are here at your service to continue the conversation. Thank you very much, everyone.